I think we're ready to get started. All right. Philip's not here to run the radio station, so I've been running back and forth. So if you've been listening to the radio and you missed the weather report, it's sunny outside. Don't know any more to say. But he is going to be gone today. I know he usually does the weather report while we're between worship and class. It's going to rain this week, right? Like all week? Like the whole Noah thing, from what I understand. Whew. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. I think. Anybody remember what Lonnie covered last week? Okay, things the church is called. Good. All right. Okay, so I didn't know if he's going to cover chapter 8 or not. So I had chapter 8 and chapter 9 there in the foyer to see whichever one. He usually doesn't like to teach whatever I'm teaching because he says the way I teach it's weird. I think the way he teaches is weird, you know. But anyway, that's the way we all are. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, working on getting this straight, let's talk for a second about rights. Our country is based on the individual rights of man, correct? Goes back to John Locke, I think probably a little bit earlier. Life, liberty, and it was changed, 1776, to the pursuit of happiness. And so each man inherently has his own rights, man and lady, but we each have our own rights, and that's the basis of what all of our laws are about. What are some of our rights? Right to bear arms, number 2. That's right. Okay. Speech. All right, that's number 1, going down the Bill of Rights. Okay. Also speech, also freedom to assemble, also freedom of religion, right? Okay. Right to not be unreasonable search and seizure. Okay, we could go down all 10 there, but okay, so we have rights. And so nobody can, as an American, say you're not allowed to speak that way, you're not allowed to say those sort of things. We have rights. That's what we think of quite a bit. My rights, your rights, that's how it works. Well, that's what we're going into in 1 Corinthians. We're starting in chapter 8. From chapter 8 to chapter 11, we talk about the issue of individual rights and communal rights, or rights of a group. And that's what we run into as we go through 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now, it'd be interesting because a lot of times in Corinthians, we kind of skip over that or we don't look at it in that context, but that's the context that he's teaching through there. All right, now, going back to the culture of Corinth. All right, remember they are very idolatrous. A lot of idols going on there. This is Greece. Remember in Acts chapter 17, Paul, when he went to Athens, what did he notice? There's idols everywhere. A later historian would say that there were almost 20 idols to every single person in Athens. In other words, they're everywhere, almost like dogs here in Benton, right? I mean, they're everywhere. It just feels like sometimes. Well, there's an idol everywhere. Well, one of the ways in which idols are worshipped is each and every day they would sacrifice meat before these idols. These idols eat? No, they're stoned. And so what do you do with the meat? You take it to the market and you sell it. Now, if you're pagan, you recognize this meat was offered to Zeus, and the eating of this meat would be worship to Zeus. This meat was offered to Jupiter, and the eating of this meat would be worship to Jupiter. Mercury, Nike, going through all these different gods which they would have. Okay? Now to a Christian would realize an idol is not anything more than a piece of stone. Okay? So a Christian would look at that meat, and would he see it as worship to that idol? Now he'd be like, man, that's just some cheap food right there. That works out all right, That's like one of those restaurants you go to. You're at a cheaper restaurant when you order by number, right? And you say, I want a number 1, number 2, or number 3, whatever else it might be. That's kind of what they're thinking. It's cheap, fast food. And so the problem happening here in Corinth is they brought up a question because some people as Christians are saying, hey, it's my right to eat whatever I want. I can do whatever I want. And other people are saying, no, you're not allowed to do that because I see you eating that meat and I think that you're worshiping that idol, and then that's a temptation to me to go and worship that idol as well. You see the context which is going on there? What's happening? That's a little bit of our background that we're working with there. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Let me find where I'm at. Let's read the first 3 verses. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. This is something I think is very, very true in today's church. We've become more educated than we've ever been in our history. Okay? And sometimes what can knowledge do? What do we mean when we talk about knowledge puffs up? Gives you a big head, huh? Okay, get some letters behind your name. It makes you a certain thing. Huh? Okay, it makes you feel more important, greater than someone else, okay? You can say, man, I've taken Greek. I know what, this word love here, and I've taken this class or that class, or I'm from this church or that church, or I've been a Christian for this long. And sometimes there's that temptation to say, hey, you just need to listen to me. I'm smarter here, And sometimes in the church, when we get that attitude, we start causing problems, don't we? Because we start placing ourselves in front of other people. Knowledge without love puffs up. Now, what's the difference? Knowledge, gnosis in Greek, like that matters. You grow in knowledge, okay? What's it mean that you need love as well? What's the difference between knowledge and love? They're not opposites necessarily, but what's the difference? Knowledge without love puffs up. Okay, give the other guy a break if he does not know as much as you do, okay? There's a difference between academia and everyday what you do in the church, okay? Because academia, you can say this is right, this is wrong, things such as that. Talking about these things as far as worshiping, the meat, eating the meat. Academia, you can say, yes, that's right, no, that's wrong, go through it. When you're in a church situation, you need to show as much love and understanding as you can to those who are younger, who still need to grow and still need to mature and still have not quite got to that level. And that's something that's important in the church, period. We need love. I've heard it said before, love is like the oil in a motor. Okay? Oil does not necessarily make anything work, it just makes everything work better. It smooths out all the rough edges. It smooths out all the friction which is going on. What happens to a motor if you run it without oil? It's going to lock up, and it's going to be, you might be able to unlock it, but it's going to take a lot of work. It's probably destroyed, okay? A church can have the right doctrine and have the right practice, but if it doesn't have love, it's not going to be what it needs to be. Because it will end up running people off instead of attracting people with the love of the gospel. And so you can be right in every way, but if you're missing love, you got a huge issue, don't you? Okay? Run over to Revelation 2:5. Don't technically run over it, but in your brain there, go over it. We have the church in Ephesus, which was known far and wide for its good works, known far and wide for its great preachers, but Jesus said, this I have against you. You have left your first love, okay? By losing that love, all of that reputation and all of that ability was destroyed. And so we as a church have to grow in love. That's what we got to have. Because, well, let me just be honest with you. I'm not perfect. I know that's probably hard for you to believe. I know, get me voted out of here. I'm not perfect. I'll never forget a lady, this is many years ago, she had written down all the verses that I'd quoted during the sermon. And I used to quote a lot more than I do now. I don't quote as much as I used to. And, she showed it to me, and I was looking through it. And she had written down twice 2 Philippians. And I thought to myself, surely I didn't say that. And I went back to the tape, and you know what? I quote from 2 Philippians pretty often. You know, we make mistakes. Every single one of us make mistakes. Now, you can be the person who sits back and judges everybody else and measures everyone else and finds what everybody else does wrong. But when you do that, guess what happens? You're going to need grace just as much as that person needs grace. And you're going to need understanding just as much as that person needs understanding. And there's a maturity that happens in the church that always has to be grown in the church of love, of understanding. Now, does that mean that you overlook a person's sins and allow them to march right into hell just happy as could be? No, because true love will mention sin, and true love will preach truth. But there has to be a level of understanding and a level of grace which is there. And that's what he's talking about in those first 3 verses. Knowledge will puff up. Knowledge will make you feel like you're big, like you're really filling out the britches. But knowledge needs to have love. You need to have that love which is there. Okay, 1 Corinthians 13, remember? Though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels, if I have not love, I'm nothing more than a sounding gong or a clanging brass. In other words, I'm obnoxious to God. Though I speak with tongues and have all knowledge and all faith, without love it profits me nothing. Though I give up everything I own to the poor, and though I have myself burned at the stake, if I have not love, it does me not a bit of good. Okay, that's the first 3 verses of 1 Corinthians 13. What's Paul getting across? Same book is coming up even harder here in a little bit. What's Paul getting across? It doesn't matter how eloquently you preach. It doesn't matter how much doctrine you know. And it doesn't matter what you're willing to sacrifice. If you don't have love, it's not pleasing to God. Love is what we've got to have. And so that's how he opens this up in talking about that need for love, which is right there. Okay? All right, now starting in verse 4. We'll read verses 4 through 6. Okay? Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and there is no other God but one. But even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father of whom are all things, and we are of him, the one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. All right? Plain knowledge here. How many gods are there? One God, okay? So these guys who talk about voodoo, okay, and the sticking of the needles and the little thing is supposed to make you feel bad in your leg or whatever, okay? Anything to that? No, not a thing in the world to that. Anything to these people who are Islamic? Is Allah really going to protect them through whatever they do? No, because there's one God, and that is the God that we worship. That is the God that we follow. And so that's the knowledge part. There's only one God, and that is the one true God which is there. Okay, that's the knowledge. Now, the love, okay? Now let's look at the love. And we're going to look at verses 7 through 13. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge. For some with consciousness of the idol until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, if we do not eat are we the worst. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. For when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak consciousness, you sin against God. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I also make my brother stumble. Okay, what's he saying here? There is not the knowledge in some. See that in verse 7? Some people don't understand this idea that there is just one God and that this is not worship to an idol. Okay? Maybe they're new to the faith. Maybe they used to be pagan, and now that they've been converted, they're a different way. For some reason, there's a disconnect here. They have not matured yet enough to see that. And Paul says you need to be careful that somebody like that who's weak in the faith doesn't see you doing this and you be a stumbling block to that person. Be very careful in this situation that you don't set yourself up in that way. Yes, you have knowledge, but you also have love. Okay? Now, this is where it's tough because we live in a culture predicated on rights. Okay? Because of freedom of speech, somebody can say something absolutely obnoxious and stupid. But our government and each one of us want to support that person because we know, because we have freedom of speech, each person has a right to do whatever they want to do. Okay? People have a right to be stupid in our country, right? You can be stupid. A lot of people are stupid. That's a right that they have. But that's what our country is based upon, is the right to stupidity. That ought to be in the Bill of Rights somewhere. That was a joke. All right. Now, the thing in the church, though, is there are times where you and I give up our rights for the sake of the church. Did these people have a right to eat this meat? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. You're not worshiping a God in any way. You're just eating food that's already cooked, a little bit cheaper, okay? Saving a little bit of money. You have every right in the world to eat it. But what Paul is saying is, guard yourself and make sure that you don't trample somebody else. Guard yourself and make sure that in celebrating your liberty, you don't hurt another person. Okay? Now, do we get that principle? Maybe? Let's get the rubber to the road here. What are some examples? This is hard. And I know several times when I've taught a class and we've gone over this, we've gotten into areas where we've gotten mad at each other. So my wisdom tells me I probably shouldn't do it. My love tells me I shouldn't do it, but I got it right. So, no, just kidding. All right. I go to a congregation preaching a gospel meeting. Done this several times. They tell me they're King James only. Okay? Is the King James a superior translation to any other translation? Not really. Not linguistically. Okay? All right? I have a right to preach out whatever I want to preach out of as long as it's God's Word. Right? My first 2 years out of school, I preached out of a Greek Bible because I thought I was smart. Then I realized that was pretty dumb. Okay? But can I go to them and say, I'm going to preach out of whatever translation I want to preach out of? I could. Am I going to convert many people doing that? Yeah, I'll never be back, will I? I'll never be back. Okay? When that happens, I smile, I go, and I preach out of whatever translation they want me to. And as long as I can preach truth out of it, it works out fine. Because I want to get past that barrier because I'm after something a lot more important, and that is the souls of men. Getting people closer to Jesus. We can talk about this or that or whatever else. What matters are souls getting to Jesus. Okay? All right, you have some other situations. People prefer things one way or the other, however that might be. I, for some reason, like the idea of breaking a cracker. No, when you're taking the Lord's Supper. There's no theological reason behind it. It's just I've always cracked the cracker, and I just want to still crack the cracker, okay? All right, other people see how dirty the hands are of people in front of them, see that they got kids, and they prefer the individual wafer, okay? Some people prefer one, some people prefer the other. What do we do here? We have either one, don't we? Which makes a lot more work on the lady setting it up. But hey, it's your choice. You just go whichever way you want. See, there's love there. We just want everybody to be happy because we got bigger issues that we need to worry about. Yeah, I think the majority of people are the wafer folks now. They'll take the little wafers. For the reason you said. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you got the one cup recruiters. Yeah.
I've been to church with the one cup.
I've preached at One Cup places twice, and both times I've sat on the front row. I think the second time I did it, they served it from the back, which was a bummer. But yeah, I'm a front row guy when it comes to that. You know, there's sometimes when we'll do that. I know I've gone to some of those congregations before, and the congregation which I went to and spoke, you know, all the ladies would put the little doily things on the head whenever scripture was being read or whenever there was a prayer or during the preaching. And yeah, I told Kyla, you know, I said, you know, you can come if you want, but I'd rather, you know, you probably shouldn't, because she didn't have a doily and she wasn't a doily kind of girl. And so, you know, she stayed home while I went to did that. But, you know, as far as you can, you try to go with what they've got. And you'll see that when you go to Benin. You know, there will be some customs there, and you're like, this is interesting, you know. But you're after saving souls. And so even if something's different, even if something makes you uncomfortable, now you don't go to the point of sin, and you can't go to the point of sin, but that's what the church is about, is love. Now we're going to hit this in chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 11, and I think there could be an argument that 12, 13, and 14 is about this as well. Almost half the book of 1 Corinthians is talking about love. You let love inundate the church, and that's going to take care of a lot of problems which come up. Okay? All right, any questions or situations that you want to bring up? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Speaking of the ladies wearing the doily,
Yes.
back in December in the graduation at Freed Hardeman,
Mm-hmm.
when they had the class to stand and led the prayer, they had the guys to remove their caps.
Right.
Is there a double standard there?
Well, yeah, we'll get to that in 1 Corinthians 11. What he just said was there's a, you know, you run through Corinthians 11, we'll get to head coverings, which is a wonderful discussion and one we don't have enough, I think. What's culture? What's not culture? How do you know if something is culture? And why in the world, if it's preached 4 times in the New Testament, are we not holy kissing on each other? We'll get to that when we get to 1 Corinthians 11. But the question he just asked, and we can do a little bit of a preview here. Remember, women are required to have head coverings, right? They're required to have head coverings. Men are required to what? Not have head coverings, okay? Culturally, we have transferred that to us, and I don't see it as much today as we used to, but a lot of times we'll tell the guys, hey, if you're about to pray, what do you need to do? Take off your hat, okay? Now, is that a scripturally sound thing to tell somebody? Not really. But culturally, in our mindset, a lot of times that's a way of showing respect, that you take off your hat to the flag, or you take off your hat to whatever.
Ask everybody to remove their hat before they pray.
That's right. Yeah, NASCAR, Southern culture. And that's all NASCAR. NASCAR is just Southern culture right there. I remember going to preach a place with my kids, and it was outside of Talladega. And they didn't know anything about NASCAR. I wasn't raising them right, I guess. They didn't know anything about NASCAR, and they were asking me about it. And I said, whenever somebody says Earnhardt, just put your hand over your heart, look down, and I said, you can get through any conversation. Just say Earnhardt, look down, and you're okay. But yeah, I mean, that NASCAR, they'll ask you to remove your hats, things such as that. You know, if somebody asks me to remove my hat, it's coming off because of that love factor. I don't know if it's something required scripturally. And we'll cover that a little bit more closely in 1 Corinthians 11 if the Lord gives us that much time to get there, at the rate I go sometimes. But when we get there, it's something interesting. That's a good thing to bring up there to see.
Paul said something to him, back in chapter 2 about discerning
Yeah.
what is right and what is wrong. And that's still a thing that we deal with today.
It is. Discerning, and is this a matter of something we've always done, or is this a matter of doctrine?
Most all them NASCAR drivers will give God credit for what they're doing too.
That's right. That's right. They.
I don't know what denomination.
That's right. They will hold their beer, and they will hug the wife that they're not married to but living with, and they will give God the glory. All right? Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Well, of course he is. Of course he is. God is very into NASCAR. Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah. And basketball too, you know.
The same thing after stopping and going 200 miles an hour.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's the reason there's the hole in the Texas Stadium where the Cowboys play, so God can watch them. Right? All right. Okay, back to more serious stuff before we start getting into the lack of love. When we mentioned, yes? Say that again. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16. Modify. It probably does. Let me look. 1 Corinthians 11, 16, she says, summarizes the whole issue. If anyone seems to be contentious, we have no other such custom, nor do the churches of God. Yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk, you know, that verse is pregnant with meaning. It's full of stuff. And it goes on and on. But that's a good verse to look at, 1 Corinthians 11, 16. We have no other such custom, nor do the churches of God, which are there. Because 1 Corinthians 11, you have a lot of people attacking it today because you start off with head coverings and you talk about silence, which is there, and you cross that with 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 14, talk about the role of men and women in church and what's required either way. And that's one of those things boiling over in the Lord's church in many of our larger cities right now. So it's a good discussion to have when we go there. Okay. The posture of praying?
Yeah, the posture of people praying, whether they were kneeling or
Yeah.
their head.
Yeah. Do y'all remember the days when you used to kneel to pray? That used to be one of those really more common things. People would kneel. I got to figure this out. In the 50s, people had a lot better knees than they do today. Have y'all noticed that? You go to one of these church buildings built in the 50s, what's the first thing you notice when you come up to it? There are stairs galore, right? 15, 20 stairs get in that place. And in every section you go to, what are there? Stairs, right? Remember the old Benton church? Were there any stairs in the old Benton church? They're all over the place, right? And then walking in the parking lot, going up the hill and down the hill, you know, all that business which is there. And you can tell that we learned our lesson because you get over here, and what do we not have? No stairs anywhere. All right. But you go to any other church building, especially those built in the 50s and 60s, I guess they had really good knees back then because they really like going up and down the stairs. I don't know.
Might have something to do with the fact that there was less above the knees to have to carry.
Okay. He says there was a little bit less above the knees back at that time to carry. And that might be a little bit of the fact as well. Absolutely. But I think that's something pretty interesting. All right. I want to get started with chapter 9 real quick because chapter 9 is an addendum to chapter 8. And so if you're trying to organize the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 9 is illustrating chapter 8. Okay? And we may go through it fairly quick. And we'll finish it up next week if we don't get all the way here. Now, let's look at the first two verses, okay? Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I'm not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you have my seal and the apostleship to the Lord. Okay? You open up chapter 9. In the first two verses, you see all the arguments of what people have said about Paul. Paul came here, planted a church. That's all he liked to do is plant churches. Remember, Paul planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. He'd go and plant a church, get a church where it's functioning pretty well, and he'd move on and try to find another preacher who would be there, who would stay long term, and that sort of thing. We don't know who the long-term preacher was in Corinth. Maybe it was Apollos. But whoever the people who followed Paul were, they were not big fans of him. And we run here, and especially all through 2 Corinthians, of Paul having to defend himself and who he is. Now, what were the arguments against Paul? Number one, he's not really an apostle. Number two, he's not one of the 12. He doesn't have the same authority that the 12 do. Number three, he had never seen Jesus. And number four is going to sound funny to us. Number four, he was never paid as a preacher. Okay? People had in their mind, you get what you pay for. Okay? And so they're thinking, wait a second, if Paul is free, you can see what his preaching was worth. Okay? So what Paul's going to do is he's going to defend himself in chapter 9 and the entire book of 2 Corinthians. Did he have the same authority as the 12? He sure did. Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. He went up against the pillars of the church, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, and John, and he rebuked every one of them. He had the exact same authority that they did, and when they sinned, he went against them and told them how it was. He had the exact same authority as they did. Okay, did he ever see Jesus? Acts 9, he saw Jesus, and he spent those 3 years in the Arabian desert being taught by Jesus exactly what he needed to know. Okay, as you run back to the book of Acts. And then we'll get to the payment section in a little bit, but I like how he does it. Look at verse 3. He says, you are my seal of apostleship. In other words, whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Okay? You plant something, that's what you get back, right? You say that in gardening terms, plant green beans, get green beans back, unless somebody mislabeled the package of seed. Okay? He says, listen, if I'm not an apostle, if I'm not a faithful teacher, then by you obeying what I taught, you're not anything either. And he says, you have the seal of my apostleship. Now, that will run back to 2 Corinthians 12:12, where he says, I have the powers and the works of an apostle. Who gave these Corinthians the miraculous works which they had? To be able to prophesy and to be able to speak in tongues and be able to have this wisdom. Who laid hands on them? Paul did. He gave that to them. And he said, if you have the works of the Spirit, then surely I must be an apostle. You have that seal of apostleship which is there. That's something really interesting when you run through and look at it. Now, he goes through. Here's his defense. The seal of apostleship is verse 2. I said verse 3. He says, do we not have a right to eat or drink? Do we have not a right to take along a believing wife as the other apostles, the brother of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have to refrain from this working? Who goes to war at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its fruit? Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? What he goes through it, he says, now wait a second. I'm not married, he says. He says, I'm not paid. He'll say that in a second. And he said, but I want you to realize I have every right to be paid as a preacher. And that's what he's about to go through here. He says a soldier expects wages. A farmer expects crops. And a shepherd who's taking care of the sheep expects the milk from them. As the oxen treads the grain, you have to allow him to eat. Okay, so he says, even though I did not accept payment, I deserved payment, and that was my right. So we'll go through this a little bit more. We just talked about the oxen. Okay, let's start in verse 10. Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written. He who plows should plow in hope, that he threshes should be a partaker of this hope. We have sown spiritual things among you. Is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but do all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel, verse 14, should live by the gospel. Okay? Now, as I said, chapter 9 is an explanation of chapter 8. What Paul goes through here, he says, listen, preachers have every single right in this world to be paid. You preach the gospel, you should receive material things for your preaching. Okay? And so he goes through. Now here's the question. How much should a preacher be paid? You ever think about that? Chickens. Okay? You know, that was the day there. You got fed chickens and pigs or whatever else. How much should a preacher be paid? More or less than everybody else? It's kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about, isn't it? Okay. Preachers should be paid to the point where money is not their highest concern in life. Okay? You can pay a guy so much that money's all he thinks about, and you can pay a guy so little that money's all he ever thinks about. You have a preacher, what do you want his mind to be on? Okay? The most important job that ever exists on this earth. Okay? We went about 2 or 3 generations. This is a long time ago. I think preachers now are actually paid pretty well. We went about 2 or 3 generations where we didn't pay our preachers very much, and we kept our preacher for about 2 years at a time. Okay?
I seen a book the other day, the Baptist church had started in their, they were getting 14, 15 cents for their plate at church on Sunday morning.
There you go. Yeah. And that's how it used to be. Okay. All right. You mistreat preachers. Your young boys want to grow up to be a preacher? I was playing in one of the classes I was teaching, little boys in this class. And we were going through 1 Corinthians. I asked them, we were going through this, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they're like, And I said, well, what do you want to do in the church when you grow up? You know what every one of them said? I want to do the PowerPoint. I was like, man, you want to be the guy who creates the PowerPoint. You want to be a preacher. I was telling them, you want to be a preacher. And they're like, okay, But you go through that. You want your young boys to want to be preachers, okay? And so how do you do that? By respect, not just money. And money is really one of those things that gets in the way of preaching. But in respect that you show your preacher, you train up new men to preach the gospel. And we've done that here. You all saw last week, Corey, Jared. We've got a lot of young men here who are very, very talented. And you can see that in the Bible classes that are led and taught by the folks here. We've got a lot of talented people here. And a lot of that's because of the respect which has been shown to preachers in the past of this congregation and other congregations as well. All right, so did Paul have a right to be paid? Yes. But Paul wasn't paid. We'll go ahead and just do the cliff notes for the rest of the chapter. Paul was not paid. Why did he refuse payment? Was it because he wasn't as good a preacher? Remember the principle we talked about in chapter 8. What's he after here? Not after his rights, but after, the souls of people. Here he is planting a church. You convert somebody and tell them to give you money the next week. What are they going to think? That's all you're about, right? And so Paul planted churches, and as he planted churches, his focus was, listen, I'll be supported by the Philippian brethren. I'll be supported by somebody else, maybe even the Judean brethren, because I want to work on my own and not be a burden to this church until I get this church operational, until I get this church moving in the way it should. Now, does that mean we shouldn't pay preachers? I hope not. What's that mean? Love. Have a spirit of love. Have a spirit of forgiveness. Have a spirit of grace. Are your rights ever going to be trampled on? Absolutely. If you're a Christian, it's coming, even by other Christians. But show that grace and mercy as much as possible. All right? Thanks a lot for being here. We'll cover chapter 9 a little bit more next week.